Welcome back to our next lecture in ancient and medieval world history. Today we're going to be speaking about the further development of medieval Europe, the rise and competition between major medieval kingdoms, especially France and England, in the late 900s and 1000s, and the rising role of the Catholic papacy and the struggle for authority between the popes of the Catholic Church and the secular kings of Western Europe. We left off with the Viking Age and with the violent troubles that threatened Western Europe in much of the 800s and early 900s CE. By the later 900s, European life began to stabilize. A mini ice age that had caused difficult climate conditions and long brutal winters from about the 500s through the 900s started to come to an end by the year 1000. As climate conditions improved, new technologies contributed to more efficient farming across Western Europe. Better forms of plows for digging deep and seeding crops into European soil were introduced. Water mills spread, and above all, a new system of crop rotation, known as the three-field system, spread across the farms of Western Europe. This contributed to an increase in the overall population. Europe's population had declined massively at the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, by the year 1000, it began to bounce back dramatically. About 90% of that population still lived in peasant villages, but the villages multiply and grow larger in size, going from a few dozen average inhabitants to 200 or more average inhabitants across much of France and other parts of Western Europe. The majority of these Western European villages, especially in France and the Rhineland, were part of larger land grants or estates known as manors. They had been divided up in the empire of Charlemagne and then among the kingdoms that followed it. And parcels of land, or manors, had been granted to important nobles, such as dukes or counts. They had also been given to bishops and abbots, or the religious leaders of Christian monasteries. These were officially granted by kings or other high-ranking nobles to lesser-ranking nobles and clergy members. The idea was that these land grants would support the privileged existence of Europe's social elites, the families of the lords, the clergymen and their staff, and often small groups of mounted warriors who defended and worked for them. The majority of the population then were peasants who had to farm the land. And each land grant or manor typically included several peasant villages, which might have a few hundred peasants living in each one of these small settlements. Peasants were bound to the land. They were not allowed to leave. They weren't able to move from one farming village to another. They weren't allowed to trade one lord for another. Instead, they were contractually obligated to remain in the same village where their ancestors had lived. They were bound to give a percentage of their labor and a percentage of their farm goods to the owners of each manor, each land parcel. They had to do various types of services. They were forbidden from hunting large game, which belonged exclusively to the elites. Typically, they had to divide their week between 4 days farming the master's land and 3 days farming their own. For the elite who owned these manors, life could revolve around leisure. For the knights, it could revolve around training for warfare. And the elites owed their relative privilege and good fortune to their ability to defend the manors which they had. In the period of the Viking Wars, many of Europe's nobles had become semi-autonomous. That is, they had a great degree of local independence in decision-making. They made the local laws. They made local decisions about their peasants. They gave permission to marry. They oversaw the various rituals of peasant life. These landowners technically were vassals. That means they were bound to loyalty and to give military service to whichever higher-ranking figure gave them their manor in the first place. But while those relationships existed, a king might have hundreds of counts who were his vassals. Technically, the counts owned their land as grants from the king. The king's ability to enforce obedience, to collect taxes, to draft soldiers from their vassals was in fact very limited. Unless the king had enough soldiers of his own to be able to enforce obedience, local nobles could do just about anything they felt they were strong enough to get away with. In the time of the Viking Wars, small local nobles had built stone castles all over France and other parts of Western Europe. And the result was a lack of central authority and a local leadership which could set its own conditions for power. So we're going to look at a few examples of the difficulties that kings faced in expanding their authority across their theoretical kingdoms. There are three main kingdoms that I'd like to think about. The Kingdom of England is one. This is a kingdom that had really first unified over the course of the 900s CE. England had been a patchwork of warring Celtic and German kingdoms since the 400s and the era of the German invasions. In the late 700s and 800s, England had been raided repeatedly by Viking groups. Some of them had settled down in parts of England. But a southern English kingdom known as Wessex managed to defeat large Viking armies and finally create a unified monarchy in the 900s. So the Wessex kings tried to rule in alliance with important bishops, with the local English Christian church, yet they face continuing threats from raiding groups across the seas. Occasional Viking groups still arrive in the 1000s, and the kings of England based at London sometimes struggle to control powerful regional nobles who have more warriors and are better than the kings at resisting Viking attack. A similar pattern takes place in France. France is an especially interesting case. It had been the center of Charlemagne's kingdom, but now it's heavily fragmented into regional power bases. There's a new royal family in France in the later 900s, known as the Capetian family. They claim to be the kings of all of France, but in fact, they only possess their own castles in a 30-mile radius around the city of Paris. Elsewhere in France, their nobles do what they want to do, and the kings of France struggle to try to gain respect and obedience. The most difficult of their relations with subject vassals are between the kings of France and their vassals to the north, the dukes of Normandy, who control numerous castles and followers along the northern English Channel coast of France. The Normans are Vikings who had settled down across Norman France, Christianized, intermarried with the local population, and thrived in wealthy trading centers. In the year 911, a Norman noble named Rollo was granted the official title to the land of Normandy by the King of France. supposedly in the ceremony when Rollo is proclaimed Duke of Normandy. The King of France wished to bestow this land on him in Paris, have his Viking vassal come to him and recognize the greatness of the French king. But Rollo refused. He said, I'm here on my land in Rouen, and you need to come to me. The King of France was unable to intimidate the Norman Duke enough to make him come and show respect in Paris. Instead, the King of France went to his supposed subordinate. He declared him the Duke. As part of the ceremony, the new Duke was supposed to show his loyalty to the king by kneeling down and kissing his foot. At that, Rollo said, no way, I'm not kissing your foot. He ordered one of his men to perform this show of loyalty to the French king for him. And so a big, tough Viking working for Rollo knelt down, pretended he was going to kiss the king on the foot, and then grabbed the king's foot and tipped him over on his back. And all the Normans laughed. And the king is humiliated. He doesn't have the warriors to really do much about it. He has to go back to Paris and accept that he theoretically controls a northern vassal who in fact is much more powerful than him and does not respect his power. So French kings in the late 900s and 1000s attempt to play divide and conquer among their nobles. They try to make marriage alliances with different regional nobles and play them off against one another. They engage in shrewd politicking to try to gradually gain a castle here, a castle there, and slowly build up the number of knights who work directly for them instead of their regional vassals and rivals. But France's Norman problem grows worse. In the year 1066, it reaches crisis proportions when the Duke of Normandy crosses the English Channel to the north, defeats and kills a rival, and becomes King of England. And at this point, the French king has to accept that his Norman vassal not only has more castles and knights than he does, but also is separately a king of a separate kingdom and a separate power base which the French king cannot reach. So this rivalry between France and Normandy expands into a rivalry between France and England. And this will go on to be one of the driving factors of European history throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern world. Now, the Duke of Normandy, who became King of England, is the famous Duke William the Conqueror. He manages to become King of England due to his military leadership, due to his skill in exploiting divisions inside the English kingdom, and also due to a healthy share of good luck. In 1066, England had a king named Edward the Confessor, who was closely aligned with the English Church, who is now regarded as a Christian saint due to his piety, and who had no heirs. Edward the Confessor waffled over his succession plan, and ultimately at different times he made promises of succession to two separate individuals. One was his brother-in-law, an English noble named Harold Godwinson, who controlled a lot of land and warriors in southern England. And the other was Edward's cousin across the Channel, the young Duke of Normandy, William. Now, because both men had been promised the throne, the situation is set for violence between them when Edward died. Edward dies, and because Harold is closer to London, he has himself crowned king and gets the initial support of the English Church. So William the Conqueror gathered a fleet. He put together a large army of knights, not only from Normandy, but he also appealed to knights from some of the other French duchies, places like Flanders and Brittany, and they sent troops to join him. The King of France, of course, sat on the sidelines and wanted nothing to do with this. William built an invasion force sailed across the Channel into England in the fall of 1066. Now, at the same time, there is a second invasion of England taking place. A king of Norway, one of the old Scandinavian Viking kingdoms, sees the chaos in England and tries to seize control of the island for himself. He sails with a fleet of Scandinavian warriors. They land in northern England, while William and his men are getting ready to sail for southern England. So Harold, the English king, is caught in the middle. He ended up marching north. He met the Vikings near their landing point, defeated them, destroyed their army, and won a great victory. But meanwhile, William and the Normans landed in the south. Harold had to march back again the length of England, and by the time he confronted William's invaders, the English army was exhausted. They fought a decisive battle at a place called Hastings in October 1066. King Harold led his men in defending against the Normans, but was shot in the eye with an arrow and killed. And William's Norman knights overran the English lines, hacked them down, and won the battle. As a result of the Battle of Hastings, William became King of England. He seized London. He gained the blessings of the English church, who switched their loyalty and accepted him as their new king. He then embarked on a castle-building program. He brought over Norman and other French nobles. He granted them land all over England and encouraged them to build new stone fortifications to defend their positions. As a result of this, the Normans are able to solidify their conquest despite initial resistance by the English people. And you get a gradual development of a court and nobility in England that is French-speaking, while the peasant population forced to work for them speak Anglo-Saxon English. The Norman Kingdom of England would then become a key rival of France in the years ahead. But there's another great power rivalry developing simultaneously in the European world. And that is the rivalry between secular kings and the power of the Catholic Pope in Rome. Now, the Catholic Church, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, had been relatively decentralized. There are bishops in each major city in charge of each diocese. In the West, many of these bishops support local Germanic rulers, and eventually they develop a powerful alliance with the Franks and with Charlemagne. In the East, across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek-speaking parts of the Catholic Church, of the Christian Church, give their loyalty to the chief bishop in Constantinople, who was appointed by the Byzantine emperor. In the East, the Byzantine emperor and his patriarch or chief bishop see themselves as the heads of the Christian Church. In Rome, Italy, a city now much smaller than its original imperial scale, the Bishop of Rome begins to proclaim that he should be the leader of the Christian Church. He points to a passage in Scripture in which Jesus is supposed to have told his apostle Peter that, Peter, you are my rock, on you I will build my church. By Christian tradition, Peter went to Rome and organized an early Christian community there before his martyrdom under the Emperor Nero. As a result of this, the bishops of Rome claimed to be the religious successors of the apostle Peter, the leader of Jesus' apostles, and therefore they claimed that all other Christian bishops should listen to them on matters of doctrine and church law. So you get a long-running dispute throughout the early Middle Ages between the bishops of Rome, the early popes in the West, who claimed to lead the church, and the Byzantine emperors and their bishops in the East, who refused to take any messages, any orders from the Western bishops. The popes in Rome gained some authority during the Frankish period, and especially the Carolingian Empire. Pope Leo III got protection from Charlemagne. Charlemagne helped him to expand Christianity and send missionary missions across Western Europe and Central Europe. in exchange, the church was protected, it gained prestige and stability, and it was able to give its blessing to powerful rulers like Charlemagne and enhance their power by granting the title of Emperor of the Romans. Later on in the 800s and 900s, popes in Rome began to give this title, Emperor of the Romans, or Holy Roman Emperor, to the kings of Germany, one of the Frankish successor states in Central Europe. But by the later 800s, it was clear that the power of the popes was fairly limited. They couldn't exert authority over the eastern half of the Christian church, and in Western Europe, while the popes might give certain kings their blessing, the kings actually appointed local bishops. The kings or local nobles made local laws. And if they interfered with church law, the Pope had very great difficulty in enforcing his will over them. An extreme moment in papal weakness was the so-called Cadaver Synod, a scandal that took place in the 890s. In this time, there was a pope named Formosus who was being threatened by two rival warlords, both of whom wanted to be the king of all Germany. Threatened with assassination or execution by both, Pope Formosus granted the imperial title to both of these rivals. And one of them then got angry and attacked Rome with the goal of overthrowing the Pope. Before the army could get there, Pope Formosus had a heart attack and died. But this didn't satisfy the angry warlord. His forces marched into the city of Rome, and they dug up the dead body of Pope Formosus and put it on trial. And after a hideous spectacle in which the Pope's corpse is propped up in a chair and questioned by lawyers in the Vatican, the Pope is declared guilty. The body is taken out into St. Peter's Square, where they break off the blessing fingers on its right hand, and they take what's left of the body and throw it in the Tiber River. Eventually it's collected and buried by local monks who have pity for the late church ruler. So this is a low point in the authority of the church. How do you reverse that? How does the Bishop of Rome, how does the Pope start to get people to respect the title? The bishops begin a reform movement within the Christian church in Western Europe, and especially in Rome, in the late 900s and the early 1000s. And a series of popes come to power with an explicit reform platform. They aim at what they see as a purification of the behavior of church members. One of the important rules that is first enforced at this time in Catholic Christian history is the law that priests have to be celibate, that high clergy have to be celibate, that priests cannot marry and have families that tie them to the secular world. At the same time, church leaders also begin to claim that clergymen shouldn't be able to buy church offices through outright bribery. It seems pretty obvious that this is a common practice across Western Europe, and popes start cracking down on this by firing abbots and bishops who have gained office in corrupt ways. The most important part of the church reform movement, though, is the claim that only the Pope is allowed to appoint bishops or monastery leaders anywhere in Europe. And this claim helps to drive the church into a series of confrontations from the 1050s through the 1070s. Now, an early step in this power claim by the popes is a permanent split between the Catholic Church led by the Pope in Rome and the Eastern Orthodox Church led by the Emperor and the Patriarch in Constantinople. In the year 1054, there's a church embassy from Rome to Constantinople that leads to a vicious argument and complete breakdown in relations. between the Western Christian Church and the Eastern Christian Church. The Pope and the Patriarch excommunicate each other. That is, they say that their rival and all their followers are not true Christians, are cut off from the sacraments and from any hope of salvation. And this leads to a permanent split, although in the 20th century there are various forms of reconciliation, walking back of the claims of spiritual damnation between the two churches. They are still institutionally separate ever since that day in 1054. Now in the 1070s, this confrontation expands to embroil the Pope in a series of literal wars with the King of Germany and later the King of France. The Pope who leads this reform conflict is a Pope named Gregory VII. And Gregory challenges a German king, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who has appointed a bishop in Italy, in the city of Milan. Gregory claims that this is illegal. This secular appointment of a religious leader is known as lay investiture in church language. So the conflict over this becomes known as the Investiture War. Gregory fires the bishop in Milan, Italy, who had been appointed by the King of Germany, Henry IV. Henry IV responds by gathering an army of German knights, marching towards the Alps and threatening to physically overthrow the Pope. But Gregory plays hardball. He uses his spiritual power as Pope to send messages all over Germany and to tell every noble in Germany that they are spiritually freed from their obedience to the German king. In fact, if they obey King Henry of Germany, they will be damned to hell for all time. With this excuse, the knights of Germany and its leading nobles rebel against their king, refuse to pay him taxes or support his army, and King Henry is forced to back down and literally beg for the Pope's forgiveness. Gregory rubs Henry's nose in his humiliation. He makes him actually come to Italy and walk barefoot in the snow for 3 days before forgiving his sins and telling him that he can be a king and his subjects can obey him again. As a result of this power play, the power dynamics in Europe change dramatically. The popes now have the ability to summon the loyalty of European knights, to tell them that they owe loyalty to their spiritual leaders more than they do to their secular leaders, the kings of their particular regions. Henry had his revenge a few years later. He attacked Gregory by surprise and actually drove him out of Rome and tried to appoint a new pope. Gregory tried to raise his own army and come back and fight for the papacy, but ultimately died while he was still in exile. This sets up, though, a long-lasting dynamic in which the popes can try to channel feudal knightly violence in the interests of their own temporal power. And this dynamic would lead directly to the mass violence of the Crusades.